Oh, this is going to be the brief introduction to the course, and there's just so much to cover. So all this is going to be is a little bit about what we're studying in biology and where the first lesson is really going to begin. So this isn't really the first lesson, it's just to orient you to what we're covering. So in biology, we're talking about life and all living things, and we can study any aspect of biology. We could study the organism itself, animals and or plants, ecology, interactions between the animals and plants. There could be behavior, and just there's so many things that can be studied. We really have to find a place to start. Where do you actually start studying it? So what we're looking at is what we have in common among all living things are cells. Right? So every living thing is or is made up of cells. And that's kind of one of the first things. And this class itself is going to be about cells themselves. What are cells? What are they made up of? And how do they work? And if we're going to understand the cells themselves, which we need to understand life, we really need to understand the smaller components of the cell. So a cell like this has an outer membrane. And that membrane is going to be one of the things that's going to be focused on in the course, because the membrane itself controls what passes in and out of the cells. Structures within the cell are all made up of membranes, especially for our eukaryotic cells, which are plants and animals and fungi and the protists. Bacteria also have a membrane structure, and it is pretty much the same thing as well. They don't have internal membranes, but they have outer structures. So the membranes themselves are going to be made up of unique molecules. These molecules are a type of fat or lipid, and in particular, they're called a phospholipid. So you may not be familiar with this, and again, we're not going to get into this yet. But the idea here is, kind of to go backward, well, if we're going to study living things, we're going to need to study cells. If we're going to study cells, one of the topics among many are going to be membranes of cells. If you're going to study the membrane of a cell, you need to know about the components, phospholipids being one of them, proteins being another major component, some sugars as well. So we need to study chemistry. And you might think, well, this is supposed to be biology. Why do we need to study chemistry? Because if you're studying life and cells, diseases are some aspect of a cell isn't functioning properly. What aspect of the cell? Well, often it may be proteins that are embedded in these membranes. A little protein who isn't functioning properly. It's not attaching to what's attached to. It doesn't recognize maybe a signal molecule that it's supposed to recognize. Or it's recognizing things that it's not supposed to recognize. Some of these things aren't working. A lot of the specific processes of life, diseases, how medications work, how just cells function in themselves, how they divide, are all chemically mediated. And if we don't understand the chemistry, we don't really understand the living cells themselves or these key components of life. So if we're going to study then these molecules, this phospholipid, and don't worry about this particularly yet, we're going to find that these little molecules that I drew as squiggly lines here are going to be made up of elements, okay, which is going to be the first lecture. We're going to get into atoms and elements. Carbon is going to be one of the main elements that we're going to focus on. So you can see some of the main elements are up here: carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen. Most all of the molecules in most all cells are made up really of those four elements. So you might see a huge periodic table with all these elements on them and be overwhelmed by it. But as far as biology goes and the chemistry within biology, we don't really have to know all those elements. You really only need to focus, on a few. So these carbons will then be attached to oxygens, and then there'll be more carbons, and then there'll be more oxygens, and so forth. And if we're going to understand aspects of the chemistry, I'm not going to draw everything here like this. This will actually go up like this. So this phospholipid is a fairly complex molecule. on one hand. If you see the whole structure drawn out, you might say, well, that's gigantic. But the thing is, every atom, every structure that's drawn has certain rules to follow. For example, the carbons themselves. As we eventually study the carbons, we're going to find carbons. So maybe I'll put this over here. This one will be one of the last things, and we'll start the actual material. So a carbon atom, okay, so of the particular element carbon, is going to have 4 electrons in what we're going to call an outer shell. So we're going to get to this next. This is not where we are right now, but this is just an example. Every carbon needs 4 more electrons. Okay, so this is going to affect how many bonds it can form. So the big structures essentially all have rules, and the rules are fairly simple and straightforward. Once you learn the rules and the details, it's not that difficult to draw what seems like complex structures. Okay, so we're going to find that hydrogens are only going to be able to form 1 bond. They have 1 electron. They need 1 electron, and that's going to be it. So you're never going to have a hydrogen and have these bonds and other things drawn onto them. That doesn't happen. It can't happen, and you should eventually understand why that can't happen. So ultimately, in the course, you'll need to be drawing these different types of biological molecules. And first, what we need to do is cover the rules. What are the individual elements that we're concerned with? How are their electrons distributed? How do they attract or interact with electrons of other elements? And then we can start to build the main molecules. So the first group of lectures is going to start off with atoms and electrons, the bonds that put them together, and then we'll get into biological molecules themselves. Sugars, which are carbohydrates, and complex carbohydrates. We'll look at lipids, including the phospholipids. We'll look at amino acids and proteins, and then eventually DNA and RNA structures, and building them all the same way, starting off with carbons and going out from there. So if we're going to study what happens in a cell, how cells divide, how cells communicate with other cells, how they produce energy molecules, how they store energy within molecules in the cells, how they store energy across membranes within things called concentration gradients. If we're going to understand all the things that happen in the cell, which you're not really going to understand everything, but to get the beginnings of the basis of how we understand these, we really have to start somewhere. And where we're going to start is with the chemistry part of it. So it's not going to be the emphasis of a chemistry course. It's going to be the essentials of what you actually need for a biology course. And that's where we're going to begin.